Hey everyone! A couple weeks ago on the channel I released a video where I rescored the recent trailer for Metroid Prime Remastered with my original arrangement of the Prologue from Super Metroid. If you haven't seen that video already, you can check out the links that are up here or down in the description or both. But in this video I wanted to talk about how I made that arrangement, the choices that I made and what went on a little bit behind the scenes. Before we take a look at the arrangement itself, I want to talk a little bit about why I made it to begin with. Over the course of 2021, I had recorded some rescores of video game trailers for Doom and Doom Eternal, and also for Metroid Dread. And I wanted to combine all that music into an album that was thematic and inspired by the music of these games, which I love. But I thought it would also be fitting to include an arrangement of one of my favourite tunes from those games, and for me that was definitely the prologue to Super Metroid. Although I've never played Super Metroid until recently, I have always loved this piece of music. I don't even remember how I originally came across it, but I've been listening to different versions of it for a very, very long time. The problem I came up with listening to different versions of this tune is that they all have different things that I like, but I've never been able to find a version that brought all the things that I liked from all my favourite versions and put them together into one recording. And when that situation arises, as an arranger, it's a great motivation to make an arrangement of your own that brings all the elements that you like, and that was definitely the motivation that kick-started me into putting together this arrangement of the prologue from Super Metroid. Before we take an in-depth look at my arrangement, I just want to look through some of my influences. First, of course, is the source, the original music from the game. This music obviously inspired every arrangement that's come since and is crucial to this piece even being in existence. But the problem for me when listening to this is that the sound quality of some of the instruments isn't particularly high fidelity because it's all being produced through a Super Nintendo sound card. So this arrangement from a Sound in Action album is one of my favourite arrangements, but the problem with this is it's missing some of the things that I like from the original, in particular some drum cues and also that key piece of narration at the start, the last Metroid is in captivity, the galaxy is at peace. I think that piece of dialogue is very important for setting the tone of both the game and the music, so I really wanted that to be included in my perfect arrangement of the prologue, which is why it's in mine. I think it's also worth noting that this original composition, The Descent, by Insane in the Rain Music, was one of my influences when writing especially the beginning of my arrangement of the prologue. I've linked all of those and also some other arrangements and pieces that influenced me down in the description below if you want to check them out. But now let's jump over to my version, and I want to start looking at the sheet music because that's where I started with my arrangement. A lot of the time, especially nowadays, I start right away in Ableton Live recording instruments and putting layers together, but for this one, because I was going to plan everything out in detail and I wanted a clear structure, for me at least the best way to do that is with sheet music, and so that's where I started. I feel like one of my signature sounds is a jazz fusion arrangement, so that's the kind of ensemble and sound that I went for with this arrangement. But instead of just one horn leading the front of the ensemble, or even two, which is pretty common for me and for the style in general, with this I went with 4 horns. I have 2 iwis and 2 trumpets. And the reason I went with this is because I had recently recorded a piece called Growth, and if you want to hear that one, there's links in the description as well. For Growth, I used, I think, 2 trumpets and 1 iwi, and I really liked that sound, and I really liked the options that it afforded me with counter melodies and harmonization in the horn section. So I went with a similar thing here with 2 iwis and 2 trumpet voices, as well as a 4-piece rhythm, guitar, keyboards, bass, and drums, and I also added some percussion layers. There are also some other synth layers and other things going on in the recording, but that's not super important, at least for now. So the arrangement starts with this solo piano and then other layers coming in, and it sounds like this. Now this beginning is completely original material, but I wanted something to set up the suspense. When you boot up the game, Super Metroid, the introduction has some tone-setting sounds before you hear this prologue when you start your save file. So this part of the arrangement to me is kind of like the prologue to the prologue. Basically all I'm doing here is moving back and forth between an E minor triad and a B flat augmented triad, which is basically just an E flat minor chord but with the E flat dropped down to a D. And when we start to add in the bass, it's kind of like an E flat minor with a major 7. Then here, when the Iwi and trumpet come in with this big explosion and the bass hits this low E flat, we get a extended chord with a sharp 11 and a 13. So it's this really rich chord. Sounds like this. And that, in combination with the Harmon mute in the trumpet, has this really dissonant, ominous sound, which sets us up to go into the full arrangement. Around here is where I bring in that classic piece of dialogue to open the tune.
The last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
As you can see here, there's a little mistake here in the sheet music. This is meant to be on the end of 1, not on the end of 2. But this A section here starts with a solo synth bass, which I think is really important to build that empty ambience before bringing in other layers. And this is one of those drum cues that I found was missing from some other arrangements. I think it's really important to have that doo-doom in the arrangement. So I made to include it here in my own. And then we transition to this other section where the hi-hat starts going and we have this ominous synth layer. We have a clash between the flat 3 of that E flat minor chord on the higher Iwi, and then the lower Iwi plays the 9th, this F. So we have a G flat and an F, semitone apart, a bit of clash to build some ominous texture and sound. And we also have some additional textural stuff, and really true textural stuff from the guitar, which is doing this pick scraping and moving on the strings. I use this a lot throughout the arrangement because Metroid music, an important part of that is the sound effects that go on. So I wanted to include that in my arrangement with real instruments, and one of the ways I found to do that was to have some noises coming out of the guitar when it's not playing actual notes. You can hear that clash between the two Iwi voices. And yeah, when we get to the B section, we get the melody played on trumpet. First one trumpet, and then the other trumpet comes in stereo, so we get it expanding out, which is very thematic to Metroid. You start on your own in this small environment. As you expand it, the world expands, and you become more powerful as you gain power-ups and abilities. So I like this expansion from solo synth bass out to other elements in this arrangement. I should mention here as well, the bass part switches between synth bass and 5-string electric bass, and that was partly because maintaining this constant 16th note bass line is very difficult, at least for me, on the bass, and it also, I think, is a great texture, that synth bass sound. So some of it I liked to play on the electric bass, and some of it I'm playing on synth bass. You can hear their one trumpet part become 2 in stereo. It really opens things up. You can see there we have the melody then passed off onto the 2 Iwis playing in octaves, and then all 4 horns playing together in harmony as we swell into the next section. Again, here we have some more sounds coming from the guitar to build some textural stuff. And we also have this little keys cue, which is, again, one thing that I found, I think, from the sound and action version that I hadn't heard in other arrangements, and I really wanted it there. I wanted that do-do-do-do-do little pattern, so I made sure to include it here. So here a few things happened. I added a little cymbal fill here. The drums are now doing a little bit more than just playing patterns, starting to build things out. We have more sounds from the guitar. We also have that first time through the keys playing this little pattern. I think I just improvised that when I was recording it and I thought it sounded cool and I kept it in there. It also means that this D section is a little bit of a step up from the A section, which was fairly similar material. Then the trumpets come in and double what the iwis are doing up an octave, which just adds to that tension when we have 2 octaves of this clash between the G flat and the F. Obviously, for trumpet, it's written as A flat and G, but that semitone clash is just enhanced with the trumpets playing a little bit louder and in a separate octave. Then when we get to E, we get this main melody again, but now there's a little answering, echoing counter melody in the iwis. Take a listen. And I've also harmonized that melody this second time here on the second trumpet. This time the guitar's playing as well. We have this other melody in the keys as well. So let's listen again and hear all those elements coming together. So now we're really stepping things up. We have counter melodies, we have little embellishments of the melody like here in Iwi 2. I have the trumpet doubling the rhythm section patterns. This is why having 4 horns is so great, is because you can do all these different intermoving parts on the top of a rhythm section arrangement, and you can also even do things like adding extra layers to that rhythm section pattern. And also big harmonies here at the end as we lead into the next section. This next section, which is actually all original material, is transitioning us into the solo section. So it's designed to kind of break the pace of the arrangement we've been getting into and then push us into the next section. There's a few things going on here. In particular, we have this da-da, da-da, and then the guitar and the bass have this little da-da-da-da, this little replying phrase. So it's kind of this back and forth between the full ensemble doing these hits, and then the guitars and the bass doing this da-da-da-da, then the full ensemble, and then these big hits with the iwi coming in. So we're kind of having this conversation between different elements of the ensemble, and then ending up with this big crescendo, the flat 6 to flat 7 to 1, da, 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 to push us into the bass fill, into the solo. And this guitar solo was recorded by my friend Dan Poole. He's an amazing guitarist and a great friend of mine. When I came to record this song, I tried to record the guitar myself and I was horrible at it, and I knew I needed someone who actually had some proper professional experience playing guitar. So I asked my friend Dan, and while I was at it I said, "Hey, do you want to take a solo as well?" And he said sure. And what he came up with was great. So let's get into his solo now and talk about how this solo section works. It starts with this little 1 bar of lead in, and Dan played some great stuff to take us into section G, the solo. So here, the sheet music doesn't tell you a lot, but basically to record this, I just improvised my bass part and my keys part and had Dan solo over the top. I wanted this section to feel very free and open, one, so that Dan had a lot of space to solo, but also so that all the different improvising layers had room to bounce off of each other. When we get to this next little bit, however, there are some little trumpet fills just to add some connection back to that main melody, but also just to keep the solo building up. And have some backing parts, which is pretty traditional for a jazz arrangement. This little section here, these little 4 bars, is just designed to break the pace of the solo and then propel us into this next section where we start to add some more chord changes. I think it was also nice to build up a little bit of a dialogue between the iwi and the guitar. The iwi has slashes here, but the guitar is also filling in here in kind of call and response. And that builds this dynamic where instead of just listening to a guitar solo for this whole solo section, there's a little bit of a back and forth between some of the layers. And what I found at the end of this little section was that Dan played this great little guitar line, and I found it really worked to harmonize that with the iwi. So once I got that from Dan, I added in the iwi accompaniment, doubling that solo. And let's listen to that again as it takes us into section H. So this H section here, there's a few things going on. One, there's this bass part, this constant bass part, whereas before it was more improvised. I did this to keep a little bit of momentum, whereas before it was very free and open. Now we're very clearly moving along, keeping things going. I also found myself just gravitating towards this line when I first was improvising around this tune, and so I felt like it was a good line. I wanted to include it. Had a good groove to it, so I put it into the arrangement here. For the whole solo section before, we've been playing in E flat minor, which is the main tonality of this song. But for this section, given that I was repeating this constant bass line in E flat, I thought, why not add some layers on the top to add a little bit of harmony? So what's going on in this section is we have this bass pedal in E flat and these chords E flat minor 9, A flat major add 9, B major 7, and then D flat add 6. They all have an E flat in them, or E flat sounds good underneath them. So this constant pedal tone, E flat underneath, sounds good over all these changing chords, and it just gives the section a little bit more movement and feel, and at least for a soloist, it means that you can be free in those earlier sections over E flat, but then in this section, you have a little bit more structure to your solo. Or maybe you can play some just nice long wailing notes and it doesn't feel too boring because there are layers of harmony changing underneath you. So that's what's going into this H section. Introducing this bass line is also really important because it continues into the next section, so it's a good transition. When you're working on arrangement, one of the things that you can arrive at when you arrive at a new section is that everything changes, all the different instrument parts changes, maybe even the tonality changes, but a good tip that I've learned is that if you keep some things the same and some things different, changing between different sections, it feels like there's a consistent through line. So in this case, the solo has gone, and these chords that we've added in at section H are gone, but the bass line, that dun 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 dun, that continues. So that's what we get into section I. And here we're adding this flat 9, or this raised note here. We're going from E flat up to E, and that's because it's starting to hint at what's coming in this section J. So let's take a listen as we head out of the solo section H into section I. Fans of Metroid will recognize that this isn't the prologue from Super Metroid, it's the Lower Brinstar theme. And this is one of my other favourite pieces of music from Metroid. I thought it would be fun to introduce this reference to another song in this tune, and it also fit with what I was doing, this dun 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 dun. I found just playing around and experimenting, it sounded really good over this Lower Brinstar theme, this ostinato figure, the do 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 do. Which is in the iwi and the keys, and also over that main melody. I found this bass line really worked. So just like before where we had, something the same that carries through, I found that this bass line worked, continuing on into the next section with now this raised note, and then adding the Lower Brinstar stuff over the top. Another thing that's going on in this section is the guitar just says E flat 7 sus 16th bubble strumming, and that might not mean a lot to a lot of people, but for me, bubble strumming is just that constant syncopated 16th plucking thing. I'm a big fan of Corey Wong, and Corey Wong does this kind of stuff a lot on his signature plugin, the Archetype Corey Wong from Neural DSP. I think there is even a preset that's called Bubble, or has the word bubble in it, and it just inspires this kind of plucky 16th note syncopated feel, and that's what I wanted. When Dan saw this note for the first time, he was a little bit confused, but once I explained it to him, he immediately understood, and he plays in this style perfectly. He played a few more notes that I was expecting. I was kind of expecting it just to stay on E flat, but he added these counter melodies underneath that I absolutely loved. So what I originally intended to be a backing part when I originally did the arrangement ended up being a more prominent counter melody when I came to recording and producing and mixing. Let's take another listen to this section and see where it goes to. You can hear there we've added in the original Prologue melody over the top of the Lower Brinstar theme. So we have Dan's counter melody on this bubble strumming stuff. We have this ostinato do 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 figure. There's the bass line is now playing this version of the Prologue bass line mixed in with the chord changes from Lower Brinstar with that E natural in there. And then both melodies over the top. There's a lot of things going on here, but all of those layers work so well together. And again, that's another great thing with arranging with four horns. You can have this going on. It was kind of just luck that all of these elements work so well together. But when I discovered, I was really happy and I decided to keep it in. And I think it works really, really well. And there, the second half of both of those melodies, the Lower Brinstar theme here in the Iwi and the Prologue theme in the trumpet, and also Iwi 2, they all come together here as kind of like a resolution of all of these layers coming together into this very satisfying chord resolution that we've heard a few times, which I've arranged throughout the voices a little bit differently each time to make sure it doesn't get too boring. And that propels us into this next section where I decided to do something a little bit outlandish and cool, but I think it really works. Let's hear that now, and you can see what happens. So what happens there is this bass line, which we've heard in 4/4 for so long, these constant repeated pairs of 16th notes, E flat, G flat, F, A flat, G flat, C flat, B flat, and then D flat. What happened when I was, I think, playing this on the bass was I just started playing them in groups of 3 because that worked better for my fingers as I was training myself how to play this on electric bass. And I realized, wow, this kind of works with 3 to each pairing. What would that sound like? And what time signature would that even put it in? And if you think about it, it kind of adds another 8 16th notes, which would put it in 6/4, but I thought it was better to express it as 24/16 because it's really not 6 beats, it's 8 groups of 3. So here we have these 8 groups of 3 16th notes, which I used this section with this constant repeating bass line paired with the Lower Brinstar ostinato, and I used it as a vehicle for this cool odd time signature drum solo. So let's hear that again. And in that section, the drums use that 24/16 and divide it up into different ways to have different drum feels. I think that's just a really cool thing to do when you're doing odd time signatures, is to have constantly repeating patterns and then have the drums change how that time feels. This little tail end of section K brings in some more of that guitar string noise to add ambience, like I talked about before, but now we've also got some more ambience coming from the trumpet. And you see hit and blow through the trumpet create ambience. I'm blowing air through the trumpet and also hitting parts of the metal as I recorded it, and that creates this full ambience with these cymbal hits. And again, that keys pattern that I talked about loving so much before, this is to bring us into this next section, which is not in the original game music, but is in that sound in action version that I really love so much. This is one of those sections that I really want to hear an arrangement of this tune, even though it's not in the original, and I think I did really well arranging it for these instruments. But let's hear the end of section K going into this new section. So this section L, as I said, is not in the original. It's from the sound in action version, but I really love the heroic sound of these chords, and I thought it would sound really good to arrange these in these spread voicings across the two iwis and the two trumpets. And it gets pretty high, playing a high C in a lot of these chords here on the trumpet 1, and then all the way up to a high E flat on this chord here, which is pretty crazy. That's pretty high. You can see also here I've added some tubular bells, which are not an instrument that's normally seen in this kind of thing, but I think it just adds to the epic grandeur of this section. I just really like how it sounds, so I just added it in there.
I just think they're neat.
I originally had guitar in this section, but I found that I couldn't get the guitar doing anything that added much to this section. So that's, I guess, another arranging tip is not every instrument needs to play in every section. And even if it's a whole section that goes without one instrument doing anything, if that's the right choice for the section, that's the choice to make. So there was originally guitar here, but I took it out because it didn't fit. This next little bit is a little drum solo to lead us into the final chorus, and there's a lot going on in this final chorus. So let's listen to it first and then talk about it. Okay, so I have the main melody here in the trumpet, but instead of what we had before in the bass part, which, if I go back to the last chorus, you can see, first of all, is that standard ostinato bass line that we've seen for most of this piece. The rhythm section is now playing this pattern here, which sounds like this. Now this line is very much inspired by the original, especially here, do 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 do. That's the same notes from the original, but the rest of it is kind of this stuff that I came up with, just playing around with some syncopated stuff in E flat to just add something new to this final chorus. I think it's good when you're doing arrangement, if you have a section that repeats throughout the song, to do something a little bit different in each version so that you can constantly have something new happening. And especially for the last time, it adds a lot of excitement. You can also see in trumpet 1, it's catching this little syncopated figure here. So let's listen to all that together. You also have the iwi catching this rhythm section part here, which we have in the bass and the keys. And then there's that iwi counter melody along with it. So there's all these elements coming together in this final chorus to just add a little bit of syncopation and excitement before we get into the final little bit at the end. So this section is another one from the sound in action which isn't in the original, and the original melody is just this downwards leading melody which you can see in iwi 1, da 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 da, and then it passes off to trumpet 1, da 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 da. Da, 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 da. But what I added here was a bunch of different counter melodies. So we have here, it's harmonized leading up in the iwis at the start. And then with the trumpet, it's playing the da, 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 the first part of that heroic theme, I guess, that melody that we're used to here in this prologue. And there you hear trumpet 2 is playing the second half of that heroic melody, while trumpet 1 is playing this counter melody leading up, along with the iwi 1, which is playing the main melody. There's also these keys, little cues here, this upwards leading 16th note part, and these little upwards and downwards leading 16th note parts here. Let's listen to all of that on its own. And this little bit you can hear some more counter melodies that I've added in, this little one here and this stepping up in iwi 1, as well as some other slower moving parts, and then a big harmonization of the end of that melody here. And this section O is mostly original material. We've mostly stuck to E flat minor for majority of this arrangement, so I wanted to include just a little bit more moving harmony here. A flat major 7, A flat minor 7 with a major 7, and then F minor 7, F flat minor 7 flat 5. So just a little bit of movement to propel us to the end, and some lovely counter melodies going on here. We also bring in the guitar playing with the trumpet just to bring up the layers as we continue on. The bass getting lower and lower until it hits this low E flat going here into the end. And then this final section, section P, has this trumpet melody over the top, which is again from the Sound in Action version. I love this held chord at the end, and then a last little heroic melody over the top, which I think is in a string instrument in the original Sound in Action version, and I'm using here trumpet. I've also got this third trumpet part, which is added in for some even more horns. We've got 5 horns at the very end. But just all these moving parts together just weave this large, grand ending to what I think is just such an epic piece on its own. But I think all these elements at the end really drive us to such an epic end. So let's take a listen to this ending O and section P. These little melodies here are just outlining those chord changes, really. You can see the C from the A flat major going down to the C flat from the A flat minor. We can see here in trumpet B flat to A, which is A flat to G, going down to this G, which is F. So A flat, G, F, right, which is in this chord, the root, the major 7 down to the root of the next chord, and then leading us up to the next chord. All of these little melodies here are just weaving the harmony together of these different chord changes before propelling us down to the end, E flat, flat 3, 2, 1, and that just makes that E flat at the end just feel really epic. We've been in E flat minor this whole time, so to hear that 3, 2, 1 in E flat is just really powerful. And then again we end on this powerful little E flat. I think it's just an E flat triad rather than E flat minor, because it just feels so open and powerful. Rather than having that minor feel, we want it to feel a little bit heroic. You can see we've got the D natural, which is a C natural. So we're dealing in kind of a little bit more of a major sound here going towards the end, or maybe a Mixolydian sound, I guess. Thank you for listening to me ramble about my arrangement of the prologue from Super Metroid. Hopefully you found that entertaining. It gave you a little bit of an insight into what went into creating and arranging this version of the song. If you liked what you heard, you're in luck. There's links in the description down below to where you can stream this song. It's part of my album Doom and Dread, and there's some other Metroid and also Doom inspired music on that album. If you liked what you heard here, you might like what's in there as well. I've also provided links in the description to the original rescore videos where I took this song and put it over the top of the Metroid Prime Remastered trailer, but also some of the songs on that Doom and Dread album were originally written as rescores of Metroid Dread and Doom trailers. So if you're interested in some of that stuff, that's also down there in the description. I've also put some of those videos up here on the screen now, so you can watch them if you like. If you like what you heard, so consider subscribing to the channel, and hopefully I'll see you on the next one.